Hello, welcome to the South by Southwest panel hosted by Texas Biomed today. It's a great time to have you all here, and I'm excited for the panel we have today. Texas Biomed is celebrating its 80th year of breakthrough science and partnerships, and founded with the vision of creating a city of science by Tom Slick Jr., an institute was launched that has touched every facet of infectious disease from AIDS to Zika, resulting in Nobel Prize-winning science related to Hep C discoveries, the FDA approval of Ebola therapies, and most recently our partnerships with Pfizer and Regeneron leading to therapies and vaccines for coronavirus. And so we're excited today to put a panel together on predicting pandemics, really looking at this visioning of what the next 10, 15, 20, 50 years may look like, both in dealing with where we are on pandemic preparedness and prediction and where we could be in the future. So today's panel is really a convergence of science, technology, and public policy. And if you look at where we are in this, we have both the short-term response that has happened from our health requirements to the development of new science to the response we have even at a macroeconomic level. And so I'm really excited with four phenomenal panelists today, including Ian Cheeseman, who's lead of the Host-Pathogen interaction program at Texas Biomed. We have Trevor Bedford, who's a principal investigator and founder of Nextstrain, as well as an associate professor at the Fred Hutch Institute. Nita Madhav, who's CEO of Metabiota, and Joe Simkins, who's a senior economist with TEConomy. I think we're going to get some very interesting perspectives. They're each going to walk us through their take on this situation. And then we're going to be following up with Q&A with the folks online, as well as some that we've prepared ahead of time. So with that, I'd like to actually bring on our first speaker, which is Ian Cheeseman here. Ian joined Texas Biomed actually to just explore the genetics of the most virulent form of malaria parasites. He combines microarray technology, next generation sequencing, and really looks at measuring mutation rates in these parasites. He's a funded researcher on our campus and partners with many people. And we were lucky enough to recruit him from the UK, where he did his PhD in genetics at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So with that, we're going to hand it off to Ian to bring us onto this panel.
Thank you, Corey. So I'm going to start today by giving a broad overview of pandemics and to highlight some of the issues of why we are seeing more global pandemics emerging or more pandemics emerging in recent years. So as we look kind of over history, over what has happened in terms of pandemics over the last few thousand years, we see in the very recent history, there has been many more pandemics than there was in the past. And these pandemics are shifting more towards respiratory viruses away from bacterial infections. And while we are seeing this pandemic may feel somewhat different and somewhat new, pandemics are most certainly not new. So as we see here, the death toll as of a few years ago is quite enormous and approaching 3 million deaths globally from the current pandemic. Though as we see from previous pandemics, particularly the 1918 flu and the HIV epidemic, these are certainly not numbers which are perhaps unexpected. So the major question that I'm going to deal with today is, why are pandemics becoming more likely? So there are three major areas here that I'm going to delve into just a little bit more deeply. The first is thinking about why there is an increased chance of emergence of pathogens, why there may be a failure to contain local spread once pathogens emerge in a population, and why there may be increased global spread once there has been local establishment of a disease. So to start with, I'm going to delve a little bit into each of these topics in slightly more detail. So it is becoming increasingly clear that pathogens are often jumping from animal reservoirs into humans. So this is what we call zoonotic diseases. So this work from 2017 highlights where in the world we are seeing increased risk of zoonotic diseases, diseases which are circulating among animal populations, leaping into human populations. And the thing that I want to really note here is that risk is global. There is everywhere in the world you see some form of risk of zoonosis crossing into human populations, but there are certain parts of the world where we are seeing elevated rates of zoonosis, elevated risk of zoonotic diseases crossing over. And these are the areas that perhaps we want to focus on in greater detail, in greater resolution when we start to survey for potential crossovers. We're also seeing another existential crisis looming with climate change. One of the major impacts of this is it will change the range of diseases, the range at which potential transmission of things borne by specific vectors are capable of moving around. So here is some work that highlights exactly this. Over the next 25 years or so, we expect to see large changes in annual temperatures. With that, the range at which mosquitoes can live in will expand. In addition to that, the duration with which a mosquito can survive for will lengthen, which means that the life cycle of pathogens within mosquitoes can proceed much more effectively. This is especially key for things like malaria, though this is actually a plot of dengue carrying mosquitoes, Aedes albopictus. The next area in which we need to focus on is the preparedness of specific countries. So Nita will delve into this in much more detail, so I'm going to treat this quite shallowly, but here is some work that she was involved in which talks about the preparedness of different countries. And this entails things like how well set up a healthcare network may be, how much funding there is available for things like public health emergencies, how well connected people are to healthcare systems. So I will leap into the next element here, which is talking about some modeling on how local spread happens. So here, some very recent work from Metabiota, which estimated which group of individuals within a population are more effective at spreading coronavirus. And you see here, this is obviously a map of the United States, but the vast majority of transmission is happening in these kind of middle-aged age groups, the 35 to 49-year-old age groups. That is quite consistent across the US. And this is quite key when it comes to prediction because it helps us inform what sort of public health measures should be in place. For instance, one of the recommendations that came out of this work was that school reopenings may not have a large impact on transmission. And then finally, as I run up my slides, the global spread is facilitated in quite a dramatic fashion by the increase in global air travel that we have seen over the last 20 years or so. This is some plots from Nextstrain. Our next speaker, Trevor Bedford, will elaborate more on viral phylogenies and Nextstrain. And I think with that, I actually reached my time limit.
All right, thank you, Ian. We appreciate that. And for those of you who are watching, please use the Q&A section where you can enter your questions so we can track those, we can log those when we get to the Q&A section of today's presentation. And those that we don't get to during the discussion, we hope to be able to get back to you with a response offline where we can capture some of these. So thank you, Ian, for that overview. And when we look at the changing environment, you're absolutely correct that the increase in population, the encroachment on new species and new environments, and the ease with which we can transport anything anywhere within the world in 12 to 24 hours puts us in a very different time frame than perhaps when we look back historically, even a couple thousand years, to outbreaks that were more contained regionally but may have lasted longer due to a lack of successful health intervention mechanisms. So next we have Trevor Bedford, who's a principal investigator with Nextstrain. He's also an associate professor at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center and affiliated with the University of Washington. He focuses, as Ian has said, on phylogenetic analysis of pathogen sequence data, essentially with the goal of making inferences that are actionable to public health. Essentially, how are mutations happening? How can we respond? And he's worked on many different seasonal and avian influenza viruses. He's looked at Ebola, Zika, MERS, and his open source Nextstrain project really aims to harness scientific data and public health data to understand the changing genomics and then use that as a way to understand and counter outbreaks. And so we're excited to have Trevor on the panel today, and Trevor, we'll hand it off to you.
Great. Thank you, Corey. So I wanted to spend time now to really focus on evolution that's going on in SARS-CoV-2 and in the virus that causes COVID. They're very top of mind with emergence of variants of concern, and I'm getting a lot of questions about kind of what to happen in both the short term and long term. So I wanted to think a bit about what to expect here. So first off, as Corey and Ian were saying, with Nextstrain.org, we're tracking evolution of SARS-CoV-2. What's really remarkable here is at this point, in just over a year, there have been over 800,000 viruses sequenced and shared to gisaid.org, which is where we get our data from. And this level of sequencing is remarkable. Just 3 years ago, kind of a big splashy paper would have 1,000 sequences, and now we're having 800,000 from this pandemic. The pandemic here has essentially pushed the world perhaps 5 years into the future this way of kind of getting all of the sequencing happening. And so it's now a significant informatic challenge to just be able to process this data and make sense of it and kind of make it useful and actionable. And it's just what we've been really aiming for with Nextstrain.org. For this tracking, I want to, and for the talk, want to really focus on spike protein. So spike is the bit of the virus that actually binds to human ACE2, the human receptor. It spills RNA inside. It's kind of where most of the evolution will happen in the virus, and it's kind of what we really pay a lot of attention to. If you look at spike protein, there have been a couple mutations that you may have seen in the news. This is 484K and 501Y. These are what scientists are currently paying the most attention to. Here, all of these green dots, each of these is a different virus from somewhere around the world, going back to Wuhan in late 2019. And we see kind of a couple of these orange splotches, these orange lineages that have these mutations. So one of these, this is B117 that you may have heard of. This is B.1.351 from South Africa that you may have heard of. And so we see at this point in time that almost 40% of circulating viruses have one or both of these mutations. They're quite prevalent in Europe, quite prevalent in Southern Africa, in Brazil, and increasing in frequency in the United States. If we look at B117, which is kind of where a lot of the attention is and should be, each of these dots is showing kind of a gradual pace of evolution that was occurring in the UK throughout 2020. But then we get this big jump here going to this B117 in orange, where there was a particular lineage of virus that accumulated a bunch of different mutations at the same time. This was very surprising. I don't think anyone really, we all kind of expected viruses to mutate more or less like this, but then having kind of this big jump in evolution was unexpected, and kind of the variants of concern have demanded a lot of attention from scientists and trying to kind of really figure out what's going on with them. So up until, kind of along these lines, up until December, my expectation was that SARS-CoV-2 would behave a lot like a seasonal coronavirus. So we've seen that that seasonal coronaviruses that cause about 30% of common colds evolve just as you'd expect a virus to evolve. If we measure this rate of evolution, we see it's fairly similar to influenza B viruses, shown here, slower than influenza A viruses, much faster than measles. And this indicates something like we'd maybe expect a vaccine update every 5 years or so. That's about how often we have to update the flu B vaccine. However, with SARS-CoV-2, it's been faster than this. So if we look just in the last year, this is now showing the number of mutations in this important region in spike protein, in this S1 region. The variants of concern are shown in red here, and the kind of important bit is just that we've had 8 or 10 mutations within this region in just a year. And this kind of makes it very, very fast. This is along the lines, or perhaps maybe a bit faster than influenza A. And so it looks like a very kind of evolvable virus that we'll have to be trying to keep up with in terms of our vaccination strategies. So it's possible that this evolution of SARS-CoV-2 will slow down, and that in another year, in March 2022, it'll have leveled off a bit, but that's unclear, and I wouldn't count on that at this point. So if we have a flu-like rate of evolution, we'd probably need a vaccine update every 1 to 2 years. They're prepping a vaccine update to the B.1.351 from Southern Africa. Flu H3N2 infects about 5 to 10% of the world every year, and I'd expect something like that for SARS-CoV-2, that we could have lots of continued circulation. The difference here is that the mRNA vaccines are really amazing, and so that's kind of something that we have for COVID that we don't have for flu. However, that there's going to be this huge importance of predictive modeling of SARS-CoV-2 evolution so we can get these vaccines right and know when to update and where to update and so forth. Forecasting seasonal flu evolution has been pretty successful, but we now have way more data for SARS-CoV-2, which should help with this. Generally, my general speculation looks like infections of previously vaccinated infected individuals are likely to be more mild. A winter COVID season is likely with significant circulation, but probably very little disease because of, again, prior immunity. I expect there to be a COVID vaccine that's offered every year. Not everyone will take it, but it will help to protect, kind of add increasing protection from what people would have normally. I think there'll be a continued push for public health interventions, but I'd really hope to avoid societal restrictions in following winters. But generally, kind of having this amazing amount of sequencing happening should pay dividends for pandemic early warning. So we can imagine just sequencing some decent fraction of respiratory infections and having a really early chance to spot novel viruses that have entered the population. This is something that I think will pay dividends into the future. And that's it for my presentation.
Great. Thank you, Trevor. Absolutely appreciate that. And even the work we're doing at Texas Biomed right now, the minute a new strain appears, we're sequencing it, we're using it and testing against existing therapies and vaccines. And then obviously as the data set emerges, the influence back to how the designers of those vaccines and therapies are adjusting or are adapting. A very interesting area with this ability to, as you said, sequence so much more, so much quicker. And so next we have Nita Madhav, who's the CEO of Metabiota, and it's a company that specializes in measuring, mitigating, and managing epidemic risk. And Nita has over 15 years of experience in probabilistic modeling and risk assessment, really looking at the modeling of infectious disease spread and the economic impacts it has. And so this includes looking at the disease risk, the burden, the costing models, and ultimately to provide intervention and actionable insights for companies and governments. And so she has a lot of background in this area, working with AIR Worldwide, and also working back at the scientific basic level in her early training. So Nita brings us from bench to bedside in analyzing this, and we'll hand it off to her at this point.
All right, thank you, Corey. So I'm really excited to be here today and talk to you about how we're making the world more resilient to epidemics. And maybe just going back to the earlier conversation that Ian teed off, we are seeing an increase in the level of risk that's occurring around epidemics and pandemics, rising costs associated with these. COVID alone is estimated to have a global cumulative GDP loss of $9 trillion and possibly more. And these are staggering numbers. Even prior to COVID, estimates pointed to an average annual loss of $570 billion for flu epidemics or pandemics. And this is a scale that rivals climate change when it comes to the potential economic losses that can occur. So clearly this is an important problem with the human toll and the economic toll, something that continues to require a lot of attention. As Ian mentioned earlier, the risk continues to increase due to a number of factors that are driving the emergence, a lot of it pointing to the spread from animals to humans and the zoonotic transmission, and then the increased global spread due to travel, markets and trade, migration and conflict, and then factors that nowadays we still need to be very cognizant of, including bioterror, bioerror, and natural occurrence of these types of events. So how does big data fit into this? We heard from Trevor on the genomic aspects. There's a few other areas where there is active work going on using artificial intelligence, machine learning, and big data. So one area that we look at when it comes to early warning is using natural language processing, looking at some of the early unofficial reporting sources, which are oftentimes going to be media reports or Twitter or social media, looking at types of early information that's from crowdsourced and from folks that are that are experiencing these events occurring, and these are often more timely than what we get from official reporting sources. I think a lot of work is now going on in trying to bring those two things closer together, where the official information is matching what's being reported informally, but there's a lot of work to be done there. So this is an area where we're, at any given time, scanning thousands of different information sources, looking for signs that something might be cropping up. And this is how, a lot of folks, including us, spotted the early signs of COVID in late 2019. Another area that is up and coming is using machine learning, including boosted regression trees that takes in data from remotely sourced and sensed information such as satellite data, vegetation, and combines it with information about where animal hosts may be located and other types of information such as where different outbreaks may have emerged, leading to genetic, medical, and also medical and weather data being put in, which can, when used in this technique, can actually predict where these hotspots might be in the future and give early indicators of epidemics, or even where areas might be for further study to look at if something is going on where the information may not yet be available or may be underreported, but that points to a lot of factors that could have emergence. And then a third area that I'll go into a bit more detail about is on large-scale simulations. So it's increasingly clear that the historical data, while we're continuing to amass it and to study it, it does not really give a full picture of the level of risk. And this has to do with a lot of things, including that all cases aren't always reported, that the information is sometimes lagged, and that a lot changes from time to time. If we're looking at data from even 10 years ago, a lot of progress has been made with respect to the technologies available to actually treat or to prevent infections. So we use simulation approaches to actually try to understand what's possible and what factors may really be influential in how diseases can emerge and spread. So we apply a large-scale modeling approach that combines computational epidemiology, which I'm sure many are familiar with now, that uses this what's called a compartment model to estimate how disease spreads from person to person and place to place. So that has quite a few parameters. And this is combined with some techniques of extreme events modeling, catastrophe modeling, social science, combining with data of potential interventions as well as preparedness levels to estimate this broad view of what is actually possible and what types of events could occur. And this can be generated with hundreds of thousands of simulated events, millions of events, and it creates terabytes and terabytes of synthetic data that can actually be mined to lead to these insights. So one of the key takeaways from this type of process is that unfortunately, COVID-19 is really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the types of events that may be possible. So while events that occur might be less probable, what this graph is showing, which is the results of many of these simulations, is that there are many other types of events that could actually have an even further and greater severity than COVID-19, which are possible. And while this is kind of a very sobering and terrifying thought in some ways, I think it also gives us information that can allow us to better be prepared for these events and even to prevent them. So what all this points to is that there really is a need going forward to move from a reactive approach, which is typically what we have to epidemics and pandemics. What we typically see is what's often referred to as a cycle of panic and neglect, where when there's nothing happening, then people aren't really paying attention to it. And then when there's suddenly an event upon us, then there's a huge panic to really react to it. But what we can do is actually move our approach to be more proactive and do more before an epidemic even occurs, such as identifying these appropriate data sources, figuring out more of how to apply these data and analytic tools in a proactive way to support risk analytics, and to increase preparedness, strengthen health systems, and create contingency plans that can be useful for combating these future events. And we really must take the lessons learned from COVID-19, understanding that these are full system types and complex types of catastrophes that require clinicians working with epidemiologists, working with social scientists, working with communities to better develop the types of responses that are required ahead of time and to put them into action. So with that I will close up my slides, but be very happy to take any questions, and also want to make a quick plug that we are currently fundraising. So any investors out there would be very excited to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nita. Absolutely appreciate it. It's a sobering thought when you look at the data that's there, but at the same time, it's somewhat exciting that we now are seeing the emergence of tools across disciplines that can be used and applied to these kind of scenarios. So thank you on that. Next, we're going to have Joe Simkins, who's a senior economist at TEConomy Partners. He looks at technology and innovation strategy, applied microeconomics, and a lot of emergent and complex systems modeling. And I hope he'll touch on this a little bit today when we look at the identification and response of using machine learning, AI, and how we deal with these very complex and intricate ecosystems. He uses data science, econometrics, machine learning, and other simulation tools to understand the dynamic behaviors that drive the world around us. And his work projects span the scope on multiple AI, including modeling for bioterrorism attacks, simulation modeling of infectious disease spread, and biotechnology research and innovation ecosystems. So, Joe, very happy to have you on the panel, and we'll hand it off to you.
Thank you, Corey. Very happy to be here today and very excited to be having this conversation with everybody. I think the first thing that I want to talk about is about how there's a science to pandemics and the scientific aspect of it and the analysis of it, but there's also another side of looking at these types of events, which is the economic and societal damage that they cause and how we might think about ways to mitigate that through proactive investment and better structuring our incentives around how we, as Nita said, proactively approach these things. So during a pandemic event like the one we're experiencing, you have the collision of these two massive forces. One is a very highly complex life sciences ecosystem where it's very pragmatic and costly and typically have long durations that it takes to develop drugs that treat the illnesses experienced during a pandemic effectively. And then on the other side of that, you have the immense economic impacts, some of which our other speakers already touched on, associated with pandemics and the fact that those are likely to persist for a long time after the acute event is over. And so a lot of these metrics can seem a bit abstract, but for a more local perspective, here are some impact estimates from an upcoming report we plan to release with Texas Biomed Research Institute that apply to Texas in particular. So along just one dimension of impact, employment losses for just 1 year, 2020, Texas has already experienced potential losses of between 26 and 33 billion in lost wages and spending, relative to the track that Texas was on in the pre-pandemic decade. And this estimate doesn't even begin to include things like excess healthcare costs and mortality and other critical dimensions of impact that are going to persist over time. So I think when you see the magnitude of those impacts, a key thing to think about is how do you invest in mitigating that impact through proactive response. And these two forces I mentioned earlier of the effects of the pandemic itself, as well as the process by which R&D and innovation happens in biomedical markets and industrial complexes, are both complex in and of themselves, and I'll talk about that in a second, but actually they also generate further complexity as they interact and react to one another in what can become potentially a vicious cycle if it gets out of control. And one way we want to be thinking about staying in front of this is to make investments that mitigate the negative shocks that come from pandemic events to our life sciences ecosystems. We want to amplify the response going back the other way. And then we also need to be very resilient and agile to the unintended or unexpected consequences that are going to emerge from the center of all of these interactives. So the first step in mitigating shocks is to understand what they are and where they're likely to cause significant health and economic impacts. This is one framework that we start to think about these things through in terms of the negative types of pandemic impacts. And they span everything from the direct health consequences down to the disruption of regular business and healthcare system operations, down to changes in public behavior, and also resulting changes in government spending. And I think you can see there are already a lot of these, each one of which has a lot of subjective valuation and a lot of complexity in and of itself. And so these things are hard to analyze, and we need to be bringing to bear a lot of the advanced analytics and tools in order to even get accurate estimates of these things. At the same time, we also need to focus on amplifying the response the other way of our existing life science ecosystems. And as you can see, these ecosystems are traditionally very pragmatic and complex and resource intensive and involved a lot of moving pieces that even under normal circumstances have a hard time syncing up together, made up of this central value chain of how drugs get to market, but also supported foundationally by things like talent, investment capital, and policies and regulation, each of which are very complex in and of themselves, each of which may or may not have a high level of adoption of AI and other types of digital tools. And traditionally, they haven't necessarily worked well across one another and have been somewhat siloed when it comes to integration of new technologies. So in a recent study that we did for Pfizer, we took a look at that ecosystem as well as the impact side globally and tried to come back with some lessons learned across various life science ecosystems and the ways in which they reacted to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we came to a couple of key conclusions based on that view. The first is that the prior investments and advancements that folks made in life sciences ecosystems are now paying dividends, and they matter a lot in the way that you respond to a pandemic, particularly folks that were early adopters of technologies such as advanced bioinformatics and the underlying AI and machine learning capabilities that support that. Another key element is the promotion of collaborations, both inter-industry as well as public-private, are critical to quickly mobilizing new medical innovations and overcoming some of the traditional silos and barriers. Then there's the convergence of digital technology with life sciences, which is helping to accelerate some of these innovations, and you heard some of that from our previous speakers and the ways in which that has exciting new frontiers that are opening up. The thing that I think is perhaps less obvious, but that the flexibility in government regulatory approaches with emergency approvals and high throughput of new therapies is actually making a huge difference in the way this pandemic has unfolded. And then lastly, the existing business environment has actually proven to be pretty agile when it's been forced to be, but through incentives and co-investment structures. And so thinking about how those might get put in place ahead of time, proactively next time, could be a key dimension of a future response. So while I've focused on sort of the negative and the downside of the pandemic's impacts to both the economy and society, I also do want to point out that there's a return on investment from pandemic preparedness that far exceeds just the dimension of costs avoided, which is sometimes a difficult thing to grapple with from an investment perspective. You can see here a lot of citations from NIH's impact metrics and studies that they cite. I just more broadly want to point out that there's a whole host of functional benefits associated with investment in pandemic preparedness that range from development of basic biomedical research enterprises that then generate improved health outcomes for regions, business attraction and entrepreneurial activity, and can just generally serve as an engine, a regional innovation engine that generates a lot of ancillary kind of spillover effects in the times, quote unquote, between pandemics. And as a kind of key example of this, you can think back to the investments that were made in the space race, that NASA and others made, and all of the fundamental technologies that we gained out of that. A similar thing is very likely to be true of a lot of the basic biomedical research spending that's now going to go into this space as a result of the pandemic. So it's not all doom and gloom, but this can have a very significant return on investment for folks if we make the proactive commitment. And with that, I will turn it back over to Corey, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Joe. I absolutely appreciate that. I think you've raised some really good questions of sort of where we are and where things are going forward. And so we're going to jump to the panel session now, where we're receiving some questions and a few logistical items. Yes, the presentation is being recorded. I believe it will be made available post-session, and so that should be there for everyone. We have some questions coming in on the Q&A portion here, so we'll work on that. But you raise a good point here, Joe, when we look at this, and I want to throw out the first question that's come in. At Texas Biomed, we participated in this preclinical work for the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine to help accelerate it and get it out there. And everyone talks about this rapid life cycle that we're quickly able to generate a new vaccine and get it to market. Sometimes we forget the fact that there's 35 to 40 years of precursor scientific work that was done to develop the tool set to allow us to do that. But achieving that sort of next milestone in maturity, I'm going to actually throw this question out to Trevor, is given your work with genetic variation, how does genetic variation disrupt our ability to predict what will happen and where it will happen?
Yeah, thank you. I think I'd probably split that into two parts. So like there's the evolution, genetic variation that's happening within something that's circulating the human population, which the main thing to watch out for is kind of vaccine updates and our ability to just have a single vaccine that sticks, like with measles. And so we'll need this for things like COVID, like flu. If we ever wanted a seasonal cold vaccine, we need to take that into account. On the other side, we have kind of all of this kind of milieu of viruses that's circulating within the animal world that represent threats of spillover. And that's really hard. So there's massive amounts of viruses out there, but if you just have, say, a sequence, like if we were handed the sequence of SARS-CoV-2 before it had ever entered into a person, we had viruses that were from related bat coronaviruses that were not part of the SARS lineage. They're somewhat different. I don't think SARS-CoV-2 would have just been like, this is the thing to worry about. So it's a really challenging problem to go from this genotype of what is circulating in the animal to this is the scary thing that will actually be very human-human transmissible.
Any other comments from the panel on that one? Ian?
Yeah, I want to kind of echo something that you brought up earlier there, Trevor, where going into this pandemic, when those variants of concern first started arising, I recall a huge amount of hesitancy to say that these were functional and important. And then as more and more data got added, as more and more data got shared and interpreted, it became very clear quite rapidly after that initial hesitancy that we were dealing with something quite different. So I think our expectations going into this were certainly challenged.
Thank you. I'm actually going to roll into the second question, throw it over to Nita as a starting point with this. So is the answer as simple as more data and faster algorithms, or does the complexity and the rate of change really force us to look at more AI and machine learning based technologies that allow us to get better insight to the prediction?
Well, thanks, Corey. It's actually a really complicated question because I think there is definitely the need for more data, faster algorithms, and AI can have a very important role to play. But I think the question is actually a bit more fundamental than that. It starts with how does the data get from the ground where it's actually emerging to the systems where it can actually become actionable. And so I think, it's kind of a last mile problem when it comes to, where are these things emerging? Where are the first cases being identified by the time it finally makes it into the health system and, comes to the attention of folks who can really do something. So I feel like there's still a problem that needs to be solved at kind of that fundamental level. At the starting point before, and sure, once we can solve that, we can also apply all of these other, massive data and algorithmic approaches. But, I think there's still a few fundamental things that we need to solve as well.
Joe, go ahead.
So I would comment as well that I think Nita's absolutely right with the last mile problem in particular, and you oftentimes have this issue, particularly with simulation models of if your data coming in is flawed in a way that you can't fully understand, the data that you get out will also be interesting to say the least. But I think there's another issue here that's fundamental, sort of in the same way that often is overlooked. And that's actually the issue of sort of human capital and talent and how both who and how we are training people to actually do the work of applying AI and simulation modeling in bioinformatics and biomedical spaces. I think we've found in a lot of our work that biomedical talent tends to be somewhat siloed historically. And both on the clinician side and on the fundamental research side, from a lot of the new computer science and quote unquote Silicon Valley type talent, and thinking about ways in which you train someone to be a true kind of interdisciplinary scientist at the intersection of biomedicine and AI, and not just somebody who can take black box AI and apply it to a bioinformatic data set, nor someone who's fundamentally a biomedical researcher, but then can't link that back to things like the last mile problem. Coming up with that sweet spot in terms of talent and training, I think, is a big challenge and something that we'll need to find solutions for.
You raise a very good point. So if you look at DeepMind and their AlphaGo game program for AI, leading to AlphaFold, essentially solving a 50-year-old problem in protein folding that they were able to do, if we accept sort of the start and end points, in about 2 years, right? And so if you think about that these technologies or tools may be in a silo elsewhere and bringing them over, I'm going to throw this one back to Trevor for a second. Is that a source of opportunity for you, or is that still a barrier in sort of trying to source out or find these capabilities that want to work across boundaries and apply them to new problems?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think maybe two perspectives here. So one is that there's all this new exciting approaches, technologies happening just in this bioinformatics analytics space. We've been working hard to try to get local health jurisdictions, departments of health, et cetera, set up with things. And there's this huge issue where there's IT limitations that you can't install software, things are extremely locked down, and it's just, there's this like hurdle to actually even just being able to implement much at all. And there's kind of the data modernization efforts that have to happen in public health are huge in order to just have data that can flow into these analytical pipelines. So right now, all of the genomic data is mostly limited not by the number of sequences, but by the attachment of metadata of when was this person vaccinated, what was their clinical course, where geographically where they are, how old they are. All of these like bits of data don't actually make it into the sequences. And that data modernization to actually just be able to have a proper data system is the thing that is most limiting. If we think of like now on the other side of like all of this stuff that's actually available, that the tools that have existed, the methodological tools that have existed to deal with genome data were designed around this 1,000, 5,000 genomes. There's no tooling that can actually work with 800,000 genomes. It all breaks. And so having some new approaches there that could well borrow from deep learning, et cetera, I don't know exactly where they come from, I think should be hugely helpful.
Great. Go ahead, Nita.
Sorry, just to echo what Trevor said, really great points there. I think the other element as well is the human element. So I think, there, as you mentioned, the protein folding problems really, more of a scientific, chemistry, physics. I think it adds a whole new element when you have to consider the human dimension and human behavioral patterns that don't necessarily follow such clean rules. So I think that's another important dimension that where some of the new up and coming AI tools may actually be helpful as well.
Mm-hmm. You raise a very good point there. As scientists, we tend to be reductionist and siloed in trying to solve the problem and look for performance gains in what we're doing in terms of computational efficiencies and so on. But if we go to the other extreme in actual health response, right, and doing some of these mitigations, to some extent, you could argue, clinicians have a hard time accepting any expert opinion other than their own. And so how do we foresee their willingness or unwillingness to accept expert opinion from an AI system that's providing input as to how they should change their behavior in working with the population? I'll throw it to Ian to start.
Yeah, so I think this is a difficult question because I think that there is so many ways in which a clinician could interact with kind of information that came from AI. When it's coming down to sort of simple diagnosis, and a clinician may say, I wish to pick from this range of diseases what this patient has, and they may be quite willing to accept things. But one fundamental limitation here, I think, is that the doctors are going to, the clinicians are going to be ultimately responsible for any kind of diagnosis or action that they take. And AI doesn't necessarily bear responsibility here. So AI will give you an answer, but if it's wrong, the responsibility will still lie on any clinician's shoulders. So I think part of the, I don't feel that there will ever be a shift to AI replacing clinicians, because there will never be a shift of that responsibility.
Joe, I want to sort of extend on that and take this one step further. You've been working with a lot of folks around the world. Where does the possibility of misinformation play into this, where AI and expert systems are actually generating or propagating what would be sort of counter to the scientific rigor of what we think is necessary to respond to these kind of pandemics?
Yeah, no, thanks, Corey, for that. It is a very tough problem and sorry, I think you're probably going to hear that response from a number of us here, but I think that's part of the issue, is being honest about the complexity of the problem and embracing that as a means of finding a solution. I think this one is a very double-edged sword thing. So AI is a tool, right? And all the machine learning things are tools. People can use them for, good purposes or nefarious purposes. And I think a lot of what we have seen, to get back to some of the things that Trevor and Nita were saying, is there's been perhaps a quicker uptake on the uses of AI for disinformation purposes than there has been on the counterweight, right, to come up with solutions to counter that type of thing. And I think that's just due to the nature of public health and some of the ways in which the infrastructure and the policy changes more slowly. I will say people are catching up. I think you can see a lot of the examples from the recent election that we had to look at the ways in which information and disinformation can be used, rather magnified through the use or lack thereof of AI. I think this gets back to perhaps a different issue, though, which is a lot of the reason that AI is able to be used so effectively for these things is because a lot of times there has been a diminishment of the role of what I'll call citizen scientists. That is, people that either come from your community or are otherwise relatable to you as a population, or are speaking to the concerns that you have, yet are also very deep in science, in the scientific enterprise and the process of discovery. And tying those two back together is, I think, really what a lot of this is about, as opposed to figuring out which side of the double-edged sword you want to push on for AI. I wish I had an easy answer to that, but I think exploring that role and how you can push scientists to be more quote-unquote activist in that sense and engaged with communities is a really important dimension.
Yeah, and thank you for that response, Joe. I think it is important to understand that it's not just a scientific response. It's science, it's technology, it's policy, and it's behavioral, right? And all of these things play a role in this. And even back to Trevor pointing out that even at the pure technological level, he now has data sets that are so big he can't even analyze them, right? And so it's a very, very interesting position to be in. But let's go jumping ahead a little bit, because you've all touched on this a little bit. If you think about it, and I had the great fortune years ago in my career of working with folks who worked on, in their careers, had worked on the moon landing program, right? And if you look at the computational power, the network capabilities, even the embedded devices and sensors we have everywhere in the world, to some extent, there's a natural resource that has emerged, which is this network of sensors, devices, computational power. And having that, what does that give us as an opportunity space for monitoring, identifying, analyzing, and responding to these pandemics or breakouts in the future? And I'd like to get everybody's opinion on this. And we're going to start with you, Nita.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it's really, there's a very wide opportunity space here. This could be part of the solution to this last mile issue I brought up. But again, I think we do also have to think about there is a bit of a double-edged sword on the privacy side of things as well. So I think we do have to be very careful about that and think, clearly about some of the ethical considerations and kind of how to balance those between the public good that could emerge from this.
Trevor, I'll shoot it over to you to give a comment.
Yeah, the top of mind is definitely privacy. We've, for our work, rather than kind of working a lot with data, we're just going to use this for public health purposes, we've done a fair amount of enrolling participants into trials where we ask them to swab their nose, and we'll tell them what's if there's a virus in there and so forth. And so I can imagine kind of being able to push that a bit on that angle where you have informed consent that if you give us access, we'll look at the location trace of your phone and so forth. But that all of that gets scary, and I do think you need consent to be to actually have any of this pushed forward.
Ian, what are your thoughts?
So I'm pushing a slightly different direction here and think about kind of the enabling technologies which are being kind of really demonstrated through this current pandemic. So we are at the stage where things like genome sequencing, which used to be this kind of mythical beast when I first started in this field, now is trivial. You can hook something the size of a USB stick into a laptop and sequence it in a couple of hours and upload that data onto something like Nextstrain and understand what it is, where it fits into kind of phylogenetic trees. This is becoming the wave of the future, and we would expect kind of this level of resolution with anything that happens in the future. So I think we are well placed for kind of speed and flexibility with identification from the technology front.
Great, thanks, Ian. And Joe, let's wrap this question up with you on this.
Yeah, so I agree with everybody's comments thus far. I think from my perspective, there is sort of this fundamental trade-off from a very economist perspective of privacy and public health risk. And how much invasion of your privacy are you willing to tolerate in order to have an acceptable level of public health risk? And you do sort of pull on either end of that spectrum. You can see people evaluating those trade-offs in real time during this pandemic to a certain degree. There's lots of interesting work being done on that. I think when you look at mobile devices and that type of stuff, we've actually seen a lot of rollout of that type of contact tracing technology and monitoring technology. Google and Apple have a huge partnership in this space. However, I would say it hasn't been all that effective, and mostly because the uptake hasn't been there and the adoption hasn't been there. So getting back to Nita's point, there's a human element to this as well. Doesn't matter if the technology's there, if people aren't going to use it, or if it's not, or there's disincentives to use. On the other side of that coin, people seem very willing still to share all of their thoughts via social media and other sort of more unstructured forms. And AI increasingly is letting us mine those things, as again, as Nita said, in ways that you can actually get to some of the same information, but perhaps without the same perception of intrusiveness or invasion of privacy. And on top of all of that, I guess I will say this makes the case more than ever for proactive investment, if for nothing else to understand the reservoir of resources that are there and characterize it, and then begin to find ways to plug it into all of the applications that we've detailed here during our respective talks.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Joe. And, you talk about this proactive investment. If you look at the insurance business requiring the mandate of car insurance in the U.S. for carriers, otherwise people wouldn't buy it. We tend to discount the negative effects in the future compared to the positive returns we can get from using that money now. And it raises many, many questions we're not going to have time for in this session, but would be a very interesting session, essentially, is who's mandating it at the state, local, federal government level? Who's ensuring that we have these mechanisms in place? And Ian and I had been talking. If the system worked perfectly from identification to analysis to response, you would not have a pandemic outbreak. In which case, how do you convince people that it was worth that investment in the first place because you never had the downside? So these are very big questions that affect how we operate as societies and how we operate as countries. And I think we should continue having those. And there was even a question that came through in these cycles, as Nita mentioned. We get a ton of companies investing a lot of money in the pandemic, and coming out the tail end, very few of them are profitable and many wash out. I think that's an open question of how that works, where the sourcing is from. And we've seen a large investment both from the private sector as well as from the government side to try and respond to this. So I think these are great questions for continuing. And I've got to thank the four of you for taking time out of your schedules to spend some time with us discussing this topic. I just got a little note that within a week from now, this presentation or this video will be on Texas Biomed's YouTube channel. So you can go there, you'll be able to see that going forward. And after this, there'll be some polling questions from South by Southwest and their digital partners for seeing how this went. But ultimately, I want to thank all of you. At Texas Biomed, we pride ourselves on delivering great science for communities, people, and pushing the boundaries in the world. So thank you again, and we hope to be seeing you in the future.